What do we expect from President Biden, from President Putin at this point?
Well, we know what we're going to expect from President Biden is a lot more predictable than what we're going to expect from President Putin, because let's get to the point here. Nobody really knows what President Putin is going to do. I think what President Biden is going to do is double down on what he said earlier this week, on what Secretary of State Tony Blinken said, on what his Deputy National Security Advisor said earlier today, which is to basically say we are prepared with our allies to put together a joint approach to whatever is coming down the pike, and President Putin ought to be aware of that. But I'm not expecting anything new. This administration has done a great job of flagging intelligence and telling everyone, here's what we know and here's what's coming, and be prepared. I think it's going to be more of the above.
To Kayla's point just now, how do you see the role of China here and the alliance between China and Russia? Who's got the upper hand and what China might do in all of this?
Well, who's got the upper hand is easy. China's got the upper hand. But I do take a slightly different view than many people did from the President Xi, President Putin meeting last week. I think that there's a great alignment between China and Russia, that they want to stick their finger in the eye of the U.S. and the Western European allies and the liberal rules-based world order that we've all seen for the last 50, 70 years. But I think that the dichotomy between views longer term is pretty stark. President Putin went into that meeting with President Xi hoping to get a much more robust set of commitments to support Russia if we and the Western European or the Europeans actually impose sanctions. He didn't get any overt message to that effect. He also wanted to get a much more serious commitment for a pipeline that was not just what they announced, which was relatively small, but a pipeline that would allow Russia to be able to go either Europe or China and turn the taps on one way or the other. China didn't do that either. So that's not to suggest that the Russia-China alliance isn't real and something worrying at a very geopolitical, strategic level. But I don't think that those who see Russia and China as allies for the foreseeable future are getting the bigger picture. There's a lot more in China's interest and a lot more risk to Russia becoming beholden to China than the other way around.
So ultimately, Doug, how do you assess the economic risks that we have in front of us here?
Well, there's sort of three different buckets, right? There's the actions. That means what happens if there really is an invasion. The reactions, meaning the sanctions and other messages that we would send. And then the reactions to those reactions. So the potential risks of the cyber attacks that, again, the White House was highlighting earlier today. I think on the former, the actions, that really depends on what actually Putin does. So there's agricultural risks, there's gas risks, there's a lot of obviously humanitarian and migration casualties. There's market risks. I don't think the markets until recently have ever contemplated, at least in the last 10, 20 years, a land war in Europe as something that they have to actually think about. There's some of these unthinkable things that are back on the table. The second bucket, though, are the sanctions. That's what you've heard the administration talking about today. They talked about technology-based export sanctions that would really hurt Russia. You've talked about financial sector sanctions that would really hurt Russia. They're trying to do their best to mitigate the damage to Europeans and to Americans. There will be some spillover, but you heard the White House today explicitly say they're not going to go down the route of SWIFT. They're not going to go down the route of oil and gas sanctions that could potentially raise gas prices, raise oil prices for us and our European allies. They're going to try and hurt Russia more and hurt ourselves less. Then the third are the counterattacks that President Putin might engage in, and we just don't know, right? The White House was very explicit today in saying, be prepared. If a cyber attack comes, we've got to strengthen our cyber defenses, whether it is banks or private companies or utilities. You know, I think we've all got to be aware of that. But I would look at it in those three buckets.
Well, that's a really thorny issue in and of itself, Doug. It's a cyber attack. We have traditionally not defined that necessarily as an act of war, and I'm wondering how you think about how the United States should think about what a cyber attack is in the scheme of an attack, a physical attack, et cetera, and what is the commensurate retaliation for that?
Yeah, that's a great question. You know, NATO has been discussing for years whether the Article 5 commitment to defend a NATO member applies to a cyber attack. And even though this has been out there for a decade plus, they haven't really come up with a response. I would say the same thing is true in the U.S. You certainly don't want to get into a cyber for cyber attack battle with Russia if you can avoid it. And that's because our economy in the U.S. and in Europe, but particularly in the U.S., is much more dependent on electronics and vulnerability if there were a tit-for-tat cyber versus cyber kind of attack. So we could retaliate against Russia on a cyber basis. But the more that escalates, the more risk it is that it hurts us more than it hurts them. But of course, I'm not suggesting that you retaliate to a cyber attack with military attack. That's something that obviously we would hope would stay off the table. So it's a dilemma for this White House and this administration. If Putin does attack us on a cyber basis as a retaliation for our sanctions, what do we do to escalate? Let's hope there's a point in which this thing calms down. It might not be until there's massive disruption and casualties, but the escalation meets escalation scenario is a bad one for everybody, and that includes cyber.